Okay, we're going to take a look at how to apply the V-Ray Fur utility to a surface in SketchUp. This is a handy little feature that allows us to create the illusion of things such as carpeting or grass or any other material that looks or needs to have that fiber or um, kind of strand appearance to it. So what we need to do first is create a surface that V-Ray can use to apply this fur to. So we'll just create a little two-dimensional object here that we'll be able to use for our experiment. And the most important thing to be able to use the utility, the fur utility, is that the object itself has to be a component. So let's first begin by creating this 2D surface and making it a component. Okay, it will work on three-dimensional objects, obviously, but for our purposes today, we're going to be trying to create the illusion of a thick piled carpet. So once we've got our item made into a component, you'll notice over here in the V-Ray toolbar, this one here that looks like grass is what we need to select in order to add the fur modifier to this object. So once it's selected, just click on this button and you'll get this pattern of a red cross drawn across it, and that way you know that that item has the fur utility applied to it. One thing to note about a two-dimensional plane is, generally speaking, the fur always seems to get created on the bottom side. So before I even do any of the parameters, I'm just going to flip this object over, and I can do that simply by right-clicking on it and going down to where it says flip along and choosing components blue. That way it'll turn it so that the positive side, or the white side of the face, is facing upward. Okay, so now in order to see the V-Ray fur applied to our object, we need to render it. So first thing we're going to do is call up our asset editor, and we're going to set it up for a quick draft rendering by making sure the interactive progressive are shut off, that we're on our draft setting, and also to make sure that our global illumination has been set to irradiance map. This will give us our quickest informative rendering. We're not going for high detail at this point, we're just trying to figure out how this is going to look. So once we get those parameters set, we can then hit the render button just to see how we look. And as you can see, we're starting to get some semblance of material or fur on that object. And just let me close this window. Okay, so I'll zoom in on that a little bit better so that we can get a better idea of how that looks. I'll make that a little smaller. Now we're going to zoom in. And one more time I'm going to render it. Now that we're closer, you can see the strands protruding up from the surface. Currently, as it sits, it's kind of sparse, and if this was trying to look like a carpet, it wouldn't look very good. So why don't we look at the parameters that come with fur. And once we set our window up to look like that, we have some parameters in here that we can adjust to make it look a little bit better. So the most important thing is the density, and the current density is set to quite sparse. So it's usually dependent on the whole surface that we've selected. So we're going to change this value to something a little higher, something, let's try something like 10 just to begin, and maybe shorten the length of this a little bit to just 1. And since it's a carpet, we don't really need the tips to be tapered, so we're going to put our taper to 0. Now that we've got that set, let's try that and see how that looks. And it'll take a second to render because of the complex geometry that we've now added to our scene. So as you can see, it's starting to look a lot more like a long piled carpet. And just like any other object, we can apply a material to this so that it looks more like something that we would want to put into our model. So let's choose something maybe from the carpets and fabrics window, just something simple like that. And when we apply it, the pattern won't appear quite as defined simply because of the long fibers, but let's just render that off quickly. And you'll see that it's going to start to look a lot more like a thick piled carpet. And that's pretty much all we need to do. And we can zoom in a little bit closer and get a sense of how that looks. And one more rendering up close. And you can see that that's looking fairly realistic. Okay, so that's the basics for applying V-Ray Fur to a surface and for how to get it to render properly.